Okay, dear guests of America's North Rhine-Westphalia, welcome to tonight's discussion, which we have called in German, der Ukraine-Krieg, Zeitenwende, auch für das transatlantische Verhältnis, Fragezeichen. You will of course know that this title alludes to Chancellor Olaf Scholz's dictum of said Zeitenwende, which he proclaimed in his historic speech in the German Bundestag on Sunday, February 27th of this year, only 3 days after the start of Russia's war on Ukraine. Since then, a lot has happened, or in some respects, hasn't happened. And we're here today to assess the situation and discuss possible solutions through a transatlantic lens with most renowned experts whom I now have the privilege of introducing. I'll start with General Ben Hodges, retired Lieutenant General of the US Army, who in his last post was Commander of the US Army in Europe, that was from 2014 to 17. After retiring from active duty, he joined the Center for European Policy Analysis as its Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies, and he has since become an active and highly respected commentator on questions of transatlantic security. In 2018, shortly after leaving the US Army, we had the privilege of hosting General Hodges for the first time in presence in Düsseldorf, and he has we've since been in regular contact. Welcome, Ben, always a pleasure. Dr. Ulrich Schlie is the Henry-Kissinger Professor for Security. Is the Henry-Kissinger Professor for Security and Strategic Studies at the University of Bonn. He's a former career diplomat who later joined the German Ministry of Defense in central strategic and political positions before leaving politics and rejoining academia, first in the US in Budapest and as of late in Bonn. In this capacity, we've been working closely together on several transatlantic projects. It's always a pleasure. Welcome, dear Ulrich. And Dr. Andrew Dennison, our moderator for tonight, is the director of the political think tank Transatlantic Networks. He's a political analyst and frequent commentator on German and international media with a focus on globalization and geostrategy. 2 weeks before the war, he published an article where he warned of an imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine and demanded that Germany step up. Now, this dire outlook, which some of us saw coming, some of us didn't want to see coming, has become a reality. And we are thankful that Andrew Dennison has agreed to moderate tonight's panel. Welcome, dear Andrew. Now, final comments before we go into this substantive discussion. All of you out there, please feel invited to join the discussion by submitting questions in writing or comments in writing via the Q&A button down there. My dear colleague Katarina will sort them in the background. Many thanks for this, and Andrew Dennison will incorporate them into the discussion. As always, it's a discussion on eye level, so don't be shy, and even if it's in German, the question we can paraphrase and translate. And now, without further ado, over to Andrew and tonight's panel. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I really am looking forward to this discussion tonight. We live in solemn times, in uncertain times, and to be able to talk to two people, two different perspectives, valuable perspectives on this question of the turning point, if we want to call it that, Zeitenwende, to have Professor Ulrich Schlie and General Ben Hodges to talk about things that have changed. I guess we'll talk about things that have stayed the same too. I think that's great. I could say general and professor, but I think since we were talking in English, and I'll be informal and say Ulrich and Ben, great to have you on board tonight. Great to have all of the participants tuning in on this beautiful spring day where war can seem far away. That certainly is true. Zeitenwende, turning point. The times, they are changing, you could say. Yes, that's certainly something that seems to be dominating choices and actions now in the West and vis-a-vis Russia. You might also say, though, a German term, Sachzwänge. Zeitenwende, times are changing, Sachzwänge. What is that? Yeah, that is a necessity that is result of the new situation. George Kennan, in talking about empire and Soviet Union, talked about contingent exigencies. That is, that you were forced by your neighbor to either take him over or be threatened by his other system, especially if it's a democratic system, which tends to be more attractive than an imperial one. Sachzwänge, when the levee breaks, things happen sometimes in weeks, where other times it takes decades. We've often heard that quotation, and certainly we live in a time of compressed developments. And before I go into the question of the meaning of the war, I would like to remind us of the challenge that we face. And maybe it's a challenge we also faced in the Cold War. And that is that first, we want to survive. We want to survive. We don't want this European war to expand into other parts of Europe. And we certainly do not want this war to escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. At the same time, we don't want to abandon our political principles, our geopolitical principles and interests. We don't want to leave us militarily more vulnerable because Russian forces are all of a sudden right next to Poland. And most importantly, we don't want to abandon our friends and our allies because that's our strength. Yeah, so that's a challenge enough, a dilemma, but I'll add a third point, a trilemma. We want to do all of this without bankrupting our societies, both economically, and we also don't want to turn ourselves into a garrison state. So how do you solve this dilemma? You know, the Germans, they might look at it a little different than the Americans. Of course, the Americans, there are 330 million Americans and at least as many opinions. So it's hard to nail down the Americans on much of anything. Certainly I'm just one of many and not the American, though sometimes in Germany, I get to play that role. So that's our challenge. Now, my first question is based on something that the foreign minister of Ukraine, Minister Dmitry Kuleba, said last night on PBS NewsHour in the United States, watched by millions of that's the people who are influential in the United States really watch that, interviewed by Simon Ostrovsky. And I would like to hear what both General Hodges and Professor Schlie, what Ben and Ulrich think of what the minister said. So the interviewer asks him whether he could imagine that Ukraine would make territorial concessions in order to achieve a ceasefire or a peace. And the foreign minister said, no, Ukraine will not make territorial concessions in order to achieve a ceasefire or a peace. And then the interviewer asked him, oh, okay, well, that means either you lose or you win. And the foreign minister said, no, we only have one option. We will win, and everything else is tactics. We will win. Now, Ben, General Hodges, you were quoted in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung a couple of days ago, saying something akin to that. Could you explain to our audience why you think that is important? And what it means, I guess, for NATO and Germany too, you know. So first of all, do you agree with the ambassador? I think you do from reading your tweets and your things, that this idea of victory, of defeating the military force of the Russians in the field is important for the peace, General. Are we getting you? You need to unmute.
Yeah, Opa, I lost the cursor. So So I absolutely agree with Foreign Minister Kuleba that this has to be about winning, that this is about more than Ukraine. This is about democracy versus autocracy. That this is about, if we don't solve this now, we're going to be dealing with an aggressive, revanchist Russia for the next several years, even longer. And this is important for European security, but it's also important because the Chinese are watching. And the Chinese are going to look to see if the United States, with all of our European allies and with Canada, if we cannot stop Russia, which obviously is not quite the superpower that we had anticipated, though it does have thousands of nuclear weapons, then I think it will embolden the Chinese as well. So this has significant implications. I think this is our fight, actually. That doesn't mean soldiers from the Bundeswehr or from the United States or from UK have to be in Ukraine, although I would support that in certain circumstances. But it does mean that we have to decide there's a winning outcome. Let me give the 4 elements of winning, and then I'll stop.
Yeah.
What in my assessment? Number 1, and this is the minimum, Russian forces have to be pushed back to pre-24 February from where they started from on this latest phase in an overall Russian war that started 8 years ago. Push them back to 24 February. That's the minimum. They cannot be rewarded for anything they've done since 24 February. And also, frankly, Ukraine's economy depends on getting Mariupol and Berdyansk up and running again. Number 2, the thousands of Ukrainians who have been deported, exactly the way Stalin did it. Those Ukrainians have to be identified and sent back home, back into Ukraine. Russia has to undo what they've done here. The third component, a long-term commitment by the West to full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty. That means Crimea and the full Donbass. And then finally, the fourth element, enough damage to Russian military capabilities, they can no longer be a threat to their neighbors, Georgia, Moldova, as well as Ukraine, and of course our Baltic allies. That's what I think winning means.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ulrich Schlie. Before I come to you on exactly that question, I would ask whether the definition of victory that we heard from the foreign minister, that there would be no territorial concessions in order to achieve victory, whether that might imply that the Ukrainians also want to reoccupy the separatist regions, at least of Donetsk and Luhansk, if not Crimea as well.
Andrew, thank you for...
Wait, I was just wondering whether General Hodges would define the victory, because you said that the stopping would be at the point when the war started on the 24th. But the foreign minister said that the Minsk solution of concessions to Putin so he wouldn't escalate, that recipe did not work. And I understood from that, he was implying that the occupation of Donbass and Luhansk, as long as that continues, there will be no victory in the way that Ukraine defines it. Would you see that differently?
No, I agreed with that. In my 4 elements, the third one was the full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty. But that one I would put in I would characterize it as a long-term commitment by the West. But I don't think that it would be difficult to keep all 30 nations of NATO together to say we're going to keep fighting. But the ultimate victory should include absolutely all of Donbass and Crimea.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, Ulrich.
Thank you for that difficult question. I would like to quote Raymond Aron, who once defined in the 1960s that to win means not to lose. And from a moral point of view, Ukraine has already won, and Putin will fade away even in military terms if he is the winner. So strategy is composed of diplomacy and military strategy. And we learn from the negotiations that they have come to a kind of standstill at the very moment, and that it looks rather difficult. I mean, my great fear is that the worst will come. But coming back to the question of winning the war, I think it will, and we might agree on that it will tremendously change the whole scenery. And I would, I mean, I have been mistaken because I predicted that it won't take that much time for the Russian army to overthrow Ukraine and to impose some kind of satellite regime in Kiev. But if we look at the conflict from Putin's desk, I can't imagine any outcome for him, even if there is military victory in terms of a negotiated peace. Then it won't be, it won't last. And I think Putin hasn't given up the aim of a kind of regime change in Kiev. And so in the long run, he will be the person who has to fade away. I can't imagine that we can deal with Putin in the next 10 or 20 years. So in terms of winners and losers, I think we have to deal with an aggressive Russia, and the general has correctly described the conditions. It will be about containing Russia. Ukraine will get an invitation of the European Union, and there will be negotiations, and I think we will see a quick solution there. We have to live with Russia, and that is the question which goes beyond the definition of winners and losers, which is already decided in my view, but it's not clear what the scenario will look like in the next 10 or 20 years.
Okay. Ulrich, very good, thank you. Maybe I could just have one follow-up question. What about this situation where Zelensky defines victory differently than Germany? Zelensky doesn't want to make territorial concessions and doesn't want to wait to take back Donetsk and Luhansk because he's seen such incredible things happen on the battlefield, and maybe it's gone to his head, who knows? Whereas the Germans, more than the Americans probably, would be saying, now, Mr. Zelensky, to stop this war, you should probably make a compromise with Putin so that he can save face. Because as you mentioned, Germany has to live next to Russia. So is there a tension in Berlin between doing what Zelensky wants and doing what Putin wants?
So the first answer, and the quickest answer, is I'm not quite sure whether Zelensky will listen to the German piece of advice. He's a marvelous leader of his country, and he is already a figure of European, even of European outreach, and he is such. He is a real charismatic leader of his country. And I think his braveness, his courage, and also his ability to address publicly and to bring the Ukrainian nation together is outstanding. So in the long run, he will not listen to pieces of advice. It must, and we have seen that in the last couple of days when our president Steinmeier had to learn the very hard way.
I was going to come to that, Ulrich.
Yeah. So
let's talk about Steinmeier in a second. But you say Zelensky is very persuasive.
My point is that much will depend on the European decisiveness to hammer home the message, and it must be words followed by deeds. And I mean, we all recall the situation in 1999, Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations. So it would be possible for the European nations to hammer home very clearly to Putin that enough is enough and that he has gone too far. But that means a decisiveness, which in my view, in today's Germany, is not everyone's position. So we Germans learned it the hard way, and we Germans also have some lessons which we have to learn in the future. But my wish is a more visible European decisiveness to make sure the Russians that they can't continue the way they did in the past. My great fear is that without that decisiveness, the Russians won't learn it.
Yeah, very good. I mean, I'm always afraid that without German decisiveness, there will be no European decisiveness. But General, before I move on, Ben Hodges, do you have any thoughts on what Ulrich has just said that you'd like to add on that?
Look, Germany is the key here. Germany is the most important ally of the United States. Germany is the leader inside the European Union. I would disagree that Germany does not live next to Russia. For the first time in its history, Germany has no enemies on its border. But I know the point that you were making. I think we have to ask, what is the priority? Is the priority to stop the fighting, or is the priority to defend democracy and everything, all the values that we claim to stand for? If the priority is to hurry up and get to a settlement, which no doubt plenty of people in Berlin, Brussels, and also in Washington would like to do for a variety of reasons, then for sure, we're going to be living with this for years to come. The Russians have not earned anybody's confidence that they will live up to any agreement. They prevented the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission from doing its job in Donbass. They violated INF, and there's so much history where we know that they are not dependable. And so unless you have a ironclad compliance protocol, I would have little confidence that they would live up to any sort of agreement or settlement. This notion, this will be my last comment, this notion that somehow we have to help Putin find a way to save face. I don't believe that anymore. I understand the concept, give him an off-ramp if the priority is to end the fighting. But, you know, his train went past about 15 off-ramps in the weeks leading up to 24 February and since then. And as I listen to the statements coming out of the Kremlin, even this week, it's clear they have zero interest in themselves in any kind of a settlement. I take him at his word that he believes Ukraine is not a state, should not be a state, and everything that they're doing now, from the murder of innocent people to infrastructure, is aimed, and the deportation of thousands of Ukrainians is aimed at not only eliminating Ukraine as a state, but the idea of Ukraine as a state. I don't know how you negotiate with somebody like that.
Good. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we can all agree that Ukraine has become European in our hearts, and the hope is there that the Europe that we want to help Ukraine can stand up to the task, that is, that its nations and its peoples can respond in the way necessary, as you said, General, to make sure that the peace is sustainable. Now, the next question that I have, and this would be for you first, Ulrich, is indeed Mr. Steinmeier's awkward press statement yesterday in Warsaw, where he said, well, Mr. President Duda and I and the Baltic presidents were going to head to Kiev, and then I guess I didn't get a entrance visa or something like that. And it dominated the headlines in Germany, not quite so much in the United States, but Ulrich, good, bad, ugly? I mean, is this really significant? What does it say about the European politics and the unity of the European countries when it comes to Ukraine? How would you evaluate this event?
Two comments, perhaps. One is I agree with the general that Putin can't save his face because he has lost it already. And I can only repeat, I cannot imagine that Putin can return to a kind of normality, to a kind of diplomatic dealing with the West, as we have seen it in the last 2 decades. And the second point is I think Zelensky is quite flexible in his approach. And he even mentioned already that Ukrainian neutrality with some guarantees could be imaginable. So I would like to, and I think this is an encouraging sign that at least that is my principal hope, that in the end, we will find a solution, but it will definitely not be a solution with Putin. Well, the president of the Federal Republic is not alone in his misjudgment. We have been faced with severe criticism. We have been qualified as Putin's enablers, as a neurotic relationship with Russia. It is simply a miscalculation, which has been widely shared in German circles. It's not only the economy, academic circles, and of course leading politicians, as the former foreign secretary. I think the point is now not looking back, but the question is, what do we learn from that? It was a terrible misjudgment which led to appeasement and to a lack of strategic outlook from the side of Germany. But the point is now what we can learn from it for the very moment, and how we can reorient German foreign and security policy. And that brings us back to the question of Zeitenwende. And my fear is, my concern is that Germany is still wavering, and the public mood and also the leading political parties and parliamentary groups are, I think, not quite clear in their analysis, and there is work to be done on the side of Germany. I think the history never comes back. So this misjudgment of Russia, which was a permanent factor in the last 3 decades, which might be explainable against a German background and World War II, and also Ostpolitik and all these other ingredients. I think we will never go back. I think for the next 2 decades, I mentioned that already, we will have to deal with a difficult Russia, not a Russia as a partner, but the main
Professor
containing Russia. Sorry, I stop here.
Well, no, I mean, I was just wondering, whether you think that Zelensky miscalculated by not inviting Germany to Kyiv, or whether him not doing that reminded the Germans even more clearly of those mistakes that you had talked about, and reminded the other Europeans that they maybe should put some pressure on Germany. So the question is, was it counterproductive? Was it a mistake? Or would you say maybe it was a wake-up call for Germany and not such a bad idea?
I think, I mean, he even invited the German Chancellor. It was a lesson for us Germans, which we have to learn, as I said, the hard way. And I think he did not miscalculate the public opinion. If you go back to the articles of New York Times and the discussions in Washington in October, in November, in December, and there was severe criticism of our German policy towards Russia. And when we look back from a strategic angle, I think we Europeans were unable to deal with Russia in the last 2 decades. We had no clarity in our position, and now we pay the price. But again, my piece of advice is that we should look ahead and that we should find a better way out, and that, of course, that we have to redefine and find a new security architecture. And my firm conviction is that we have to renew the transatlantic relationship and even bring more to the table in NATO. We Germans do have to bring more to the table, but that applies also for other European partners. I don't want to finger point to France and to other European countries, but I think it is a clear lesson for us Europeans. And I mentioned that the French president, for example, has been terribly mistaken in his policy towards Russia. And he has now to learn even it the same way as we Germans.
Okay, so Zeitenwende ist auf Lernzeit or something like that. General, you have thoughts on that? The Steinmeier, Braglio, Germany learning its lessons. You live in Germany, right? You probably know Germans better than they know themselves. But what do you think?
I think that President Zelensky made a mistake here because Germany is going to be the key to Ukraine's future. Of course, I completely understand the frustration that Ukrainians have with Germany, certainly that many of us do. But the fact is, if this is about winning, then Ukraine needs every friend it can have. It needs all the economic support it can get in the near term, but also in the long term. While the EU may or may not invite Ukraine to join the EU is going to have to join Ukraine as soon as possible to help begin rebuilding. Otherwise, you've got millions of refugees that are inside EU countries that have nothing to which they can go back. So I think that President Zelensky probably could have been more artful in this case. On the other hand, it's also a way, I mean, he's shown himself to be very smart. So I don't think this was a fit of anger where he said that. In a way, it's like the Spanish conquistador who told his men to burn the ships as they marched into the New World, because he's basically saying, we're not going to negotiate an end to this, because Germany would clearly be the key to negotiation. And he's basically saying, you can stay out. We're going to fight to victory. So I'm being a little bit, I'm talking out both sides of my mouth here, that I can see where he'd be frustrated, but he also could be signaling to his own people, we're in this. I'm not looking for the Germans to bail me out, but he is going to need Germany to help in the future. The last thing I would say, though, this is, of course, it's embarrassing, and I've already heard from my German friends that have said, "Oh, Zelensky should be careful that he doesn't overplay his hand." But this is a reflection of something that I think everybody that's listening here right now, otherwise you wouldn't be tuning into an America House event if you didn't care. Germany's role in the world. What do Germans want to be? How does Germany see itself as a strategic player? You're right on the cusp of losing all credibility in Europe. I mean, when the Ukrainian president tells the federal president, stay out, and you've got other European countries that are getting a little bit weary of having Berlin wag their finger at them for violation of European values and this sort of thing, while at the same time, Germany stands by as Russia smashes those European values. So I think it was important that Chancellor Scholz made the statement that he made. I thought that took some real courage. Just by the way, like it took President Steinmeier, courage to publicly say, I was wrong the last 20 years. That's hard. You won't find too many big high-level politicians that will do that. But the key, will Germany follow through? After what Chancellor Scholz said, is the Bundestag going to follow through? I mean, even after that huge statement, you still have Defense Minister Lambrecht saying, no, we're not going to let Rheinmetall repair these old mortars and give them to the Ukrainians because it might affect German defense readiness. I mean, give me a break. A brand new lieutenant could see right through that. So Germany's still conflicted.
Yes, we will pick up on Germany again. I mean, it is certainly a crucial question, not just for Europe, but for the United States too, because it's hard to imagine European unity really flourishing unless Germany is fully engaged. But we know Germany is conflicted. My last quote excerpt is one from the American president. Biden has spent a lot of time in Europe, certainly brought a different mood to transatlantic relations than Trump. Whether you think Trump was a helpful wake-up call for Europe or not, things are certainly different. But there were, at the same time, ongoing conflicts between the Biden administration and the Europeans, various Europeans. This war has concentrated minds like little else can. And Europe and America have come together, and Biden has gone to the NATO summits and the G7 and the EU, and von der Leyen also going to Kiev. That was an impressive visit. Biden hasn't gone to Kiev yet, but Biden has been here with the Europeans, and people have remarked at the amazing consensus. And I would say, well, yeah, but the strategic arguments are pretty compelling too. And some people say, yes, there's consensus, but especially from Germany, there's maybe more braking than being, putting the foot on the accelerator. Whatever that may be, when Biden went to Warsaw, he shook up that consensus a little bit with something he's known to do. And we have to ask ourselves whether it really was this American word gaffe, something said that might be true, but one shouldn't say it. Like, darling, do I look as beautiful as I did 30 years ago? So here is Biden in Warsaw giving his speech on the 26th of March, and it's a compelling speech. And he's finding his voice, and he's getting at the end, and his last sentence is in the name of God. This man cannot stay, and he put black on white his belief that Putin needs to somehow not be in office anymore if we're really going to have peace with Russia. And that raises the question of whether any kind of peace in Ukraine is really just the ceasefire, and that to have a real European peace with equal security and every nation able to choose its own alliance, and every nation a house or an apartment in the European house with a voice, but not with a veto. Where does America stand? Where do you stand, Ben Hodges, on the question of how much pressure one should put on the Russian government in the hope that it will change its tune? And we know the Russians have intervened in American domestic politics. I guess we know how to do it in Russia too. But is that something that we can get consensus on in the alliance to really articulate the desire to have Putin and his clique not only sanctioned for their illegal activity, but really replaced before we can make a peace with Russia? Was it right for Biden to say this man must go? Ben.
I loved it. I was proud that he said that. Just like when he said that. So there were people that were wetting themselves, almost diplomats almost fainted, like, you can't say that. But you know what? When President Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire, and Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I mean, these were not exactly elegant diplomatic statements. It gave a statement of intention of what we believed in, what we stood for, and what was important. And I think that's one of the roles of the American president. Secretary Blinken, the team, they'll come around, they'll pick up the broken glass. American president to say that. And I actually don't think it was a gaffe. I think it was intentional. You know, he had spent the entire day surrounded by Ukraine and talking to him. So of course he's feeling that, and I think that's who he is. Now, that I would also say that he was correct to say, look, this is not American policy that we go do regime change very well. But I do believe that getting information to Russian people, getting the truth to Russian people, is just as important as getting long-range rockets to Ukrainian soldiers. So finding a way, like we did during the Cold War, to communicate to the other side, to try and reach people, to explain what's going on. And now everybody I talk to that knows Russians or has family members that are in Russia, they say, man, I have tried. They absolutely refuse to believe what we say, that they are so hooked on what they from the States. So we've got a real challenge in terms of Russian people. That does not mean we should not try. There are millions of Europeans that have Russian business connections or family members or friends that we should all be trying to reach. The last point I would make on this, though, is that we, the West, and particularly the United States, we have got, this is President Biden, I think, correctly said that American foreign policy has got to be based on a domestic policy. And that includes setting the example in terms of a strong liberal democratic society. And I think everybody can see that we are really vulnerable right now, and that we've got a lot of work to do at home if we expect to be a real force around the world on defending democracy.
Thank you. Thank you. Ulrich, Putin must go. Should that be an explicit goal? Should that be an implicit goal? Or should we simply accept that the West is going to have to make a deal with this person that Biden has also accused of committing genocide? How do you see the Putin must go question?
I mean, I fully share the goal, but certainly from a diplomatic point of view, it mustn't be an explicit goal. I cannot imagine that Putin will stay. I mean, the Russians don't deserve Putin, and I think we Germans, from our own history, should differentiate between the Russian people and the Russian leadership. Putin made not only took the wrong decisions, he made strategic miscalculation, but he's now a war criminal. And the war will go on, and we will see more atrocities. We will see genocide. I think I cannot imagine that Putin will return to the diplomatic table. He is rational in his own logic, and we have miscalculated him, but I don't see, the longer the war goes on and the more atrocities we will see, I cannot imagine that Putin, as a kind of Assad or Milosevic, will return to the table.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I'd like to wrap this up by asking what this war means for NATO. US interests in NATO, German interests in NATO. We need to remember NATO is not an actor as such, but it is a team of players, sometimes egotistical and selfish players, sometimes altruistic and totally committed. It is a team. I mean, yeah, some things are old. We've done the Cold War before, right? And what did they say? Terror attacks come and go, but great power conflict remains, something along those lines. And and then we're going to go to some questions. But General Ben Hodges, what do you think NATO needs to do in the short term with the end of the war, and also in long term, but really in the next year, let's say?
Well, I think it's instructive that despite challenges of any coalition, and our alliance is not perfect, there are nations still in a queue wanting to get into news here now about Sweden and Finland, both close to the decision for formal application for membership. What a colossal mistake by Putin to have done something that would cause it in NATO. This is, in my view, one of the most important outcomes so far of this war. So what should the alliance do? Obviously, welcome Sweden and Finland immediately, should they apply. Secondly, I think that we are going to see permanently based NATO troops in former Warsaw Pact countries like Romania and Poland, and former Soviet republics like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, of what he claimed he was trying to prevent. I don't think these will be large numbers, and I don't believe that they will be repositioning of Americans who are further to the east, but instead additional U.S. and perhaps others. Our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, said the other day in front of Congress that he could envision permanent bases, but not necessarily permanent troops. In other words, that's the same model we've used in Korea now. Bases that are permanent, but the soldiers for 1 year rotations, perhaps, maybe that. But nonetheless, this would be significant strengthening if you have U.S. and other allied countries in a permanent based status along NATO's eastern flank.
Excellent. Yes, time to build some barracks, it would seem, all along the eastern flank. EFP moves on. Though one question I would add to that before I turn to you, Ulrich. Ben, do you think on also the operational and even maybe tactical level, do you see the United States military changing the nature and quantity of its presence in Europe more than the European countries and their militaries? Or do you think that this will be a time where, as much as the United States is concerned about Russia, and we are the backbone of NATO, it is really a time where the Europeans, in terms of long-term defense planning, are going to start putting capacity on the table. How do you see that?
I think there is going to be massive pressure from the White House, like there has been from every, to contribute more towards this. What I would hope they will do, we will do, is bring in more logisticians, more of what we call enabler, rapid reinforcement by a lot of infantry and tanks and that sort of air defense, the intelligence, the headquarters, grow that and turn to our allies to take on more responsibility of combat forces. For an example, one of our biggest vulnerabilities right now today, we just absolutely do not have enough capability. And as we've all been watching what's happening in Ukraine the last 7 weeks, I mean, every day the sky is full of Russian missiles, rockets, aircraft. So they've shown that they are prepared to bomb the hell out of cities, enough capacity to protect all of the critical seaports as well as the population centers in Europe. This is where I think Germany and the Netherlands in particular could play for air and missile defense, at least for Poland, Baltic.
Yes. We're having a little trouble with the connection. Air defense, missile defense, essential to the future of the alliance. I guess we could even say there's a sort of missile gap in Europe when you look at the kind of missiles that could rain down on Germany, unobstructed, unopposed. Professor Ulrich Schlie, the question of how NATO should respond in the next year and how America and Europe will change, also maybe in their relationship to each other at this time.
Well, very, very quick. The answer is that NATO is not brain dead, but around and kicking. We need more NATO. We need the firm commitment. And I can only imagine a renewal of the transatlantic relationship with an active and an engaged NATO. That means that we have to take over more responsibility in a worldwide alliance as a global net of security. We have to bring more to the table. That's quite obvious, and that has been debated already in Germany, but it's still under debate. It's not yet decided. I think we have to be aware of that. And also, it's time for the Europeans. I would be provocative if I would say that leave Russia to the Europeans, and we Europeans have made the lesson from the last, drawn the lesson from the last 2 decades that we were not decisive enough to deal with Russia as a strategic challenge. But now it's time to end all illusions. I think the debates on European autonomy will come to a term, and we Europeans have to bring more to the table. We would like to welcome Sweden and Finland within NATO. Even Austria would be invited to join. The Austrians are not as far as asking for membership so far, but I think we will see a tremendous change in the years to come in terms of European security. And the great question, China has not been mentioned in our debate, but there are several lessons which we have to draw when we look at world events. We cannot afford a unilateral policy towards China, and China will be described as a strategic challenge in the new forthcoming strategic concept to be adopted by the heads of state and government in June this year.
Maybe a follow-up question on that. The NATO summit already, the communique last year, talked about the threat coming from China, and it was a significant step for NATO to talk about the Indo-Pacific as a security challenge. Do you see Germany having a military focus on the Pacific in the future with its future shipbuilding plans and even deploying aircraft to friendly Pacific nations?
Well, we have come a long way already, and change will not take place overnight. It takes some time to prepare for the change. It takes also some time to reorient our German armed forces and to find an even closer relationship with the society, the armed forces, and the administration. I think there are a lot of leadership tasks ahead, but as the former Chancellor Angela Merkel said, this is without alternative.
Good. Okay. All right. Well, I enjoyed this incredibly. Very insightful comments, concise, to the point. I appreciate that. We have a question. One question so far. I hope some other people are now ready to raise their hands and line up in the question queue. At the beginning, I said one of the challenges is to win this fight without bankrupting ourselves. And a question comes regarding how high inflation rates and low economic growth and social unrest, maybe, how that will affect the willingness of the West, and I guess Germany and the United States, we should really say, to carry on this fight, to continue to boycott Russia, even though energy and food prices are going through the roof. How do we deal with that side of the question? Let me ask you first, Ben.
So this is a good question. And of course, every nation, every national leader has to make foreign policy decisions and strategic decisions while taking into consideration. So the United States, of course, we have our midterm elections coming up here in November, presidential elections just 2 years. And even though actually the US economy is doing great right now, the president's getting no credit for it because inflation is so bad. And so he and his party, which is in real danger of losing control of the House and or the Senate, will be, of course, they'll have to make decisions about strategy and foreign policy that could help or hurt their own domestic situation, domestic political situation. I think that's true in UK. I mean, it's true in every country. I think half of what Putin does is based on his own domestic calculations, and what President Xi does is based on his domestic calculation. So this is where real political courage comes in. When the leader says, hey, look, we're going to raise taxes and we're going to do the following things because what this is about is so much more important than an extra 10 cents on the gallon for fuel or 1 or 2 degrees warmer, cooler in your home. And let me explain why. I'm old enough to remember very long gas lines back in the 70s during the Carter administration, during the oil embargo. I think Germany dealt with a period of time where there was no driving allowed on Sunday afternoons. I mean, people have been through a lot worse. So this is where political courage comes in. We made a huge mistake in Afghanistan over the course of 20 years by none of the four presidents, from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden, facing the American people and saying, all right, this is why it's important for us. And by the way, it's so important, we're going to put a tax on all of you to help pay for what we're doing. We never did that. And then here we are this, last year, everybody's wringing their hands like, what the hell happened? How did we make such a colossal failure? I think our president is going to have to stand in front of the American people and say, let me tell you why this is so important, and why it's the long-term good of the United States that we are on the side of defending democracy.
Thank you. Ulrich, how would a message like that come across in Germany? Because we know the Germans are reluctant to become leaders in supplying military equipment to Ukraine. But we also know that the Germans are reluctant to hurt the economy too much by stopping the purchase of gas and oil from Russia. And there's probably a breaking point in Germany when it comes to refugees and how many refugees people would have here. So how do you see, I guess, the strategic resilience of German society in this challenge? And what do you think politicians should say to make Germans more willing to carry that burden that Ben thinks Americans will carry if American politicians are persuasive enough? Ulrich.
Well, Andrew, this is the real meaning of Zeitenwende. It is demanding, but again, I can only rephrase what the general alluded at. It's a question of political leadership, and we look back at the success of our democracy after World War II. And we know what we owe our allies and friends. If I go back to the 1960s, the crisis of Berlin. And I think what counts most, and Henry-Kissinger and others refer to that, is courage and character. And you have to be firm in your analysis, and you have to draw the right conclusions. And that's hopefully what we expect from our political leaders. And in strategy, one learns that it's always the unexpected. And I think we are back to square one of our discussion of Zeitenwende. This is indeed the real meaning of Zeitenwende. There's a lot of change, and I think there will be more surprises, strategic surprises in the years ahead. Many thanks.
I think those are very good concluding words that we can ponder in these changing times. It's important, yes, to think seriously and to learn. And I think we all had an opportunity tonight to think seriously and to learn a great deal about the dilemmas. There's no easy way to solve these problems. But when people put their heads together, we can make progress. And before turning it over to Ben, again, want to thank, turning it over to Ben at the America House. I want to thank you very much, General, for your time and insight, and Professor for yours, Ulrich Schlie, General Ben Hodges. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I join in my thanks to both Ben Hodges and Ulrich Schlie, and of course, last but by no means least, Andrew Dennison for pulling together the discussion. And despite some technical issues, I think that the points got across well, and I thank all of you for your insights, for your expertise, for discussing such hefty topics at a time when maybe some of us don't see the road ahead yet. And yeah, Ulrich, I agree that there are the times they are changing and changes are ahead. And I mean, that's the thing about the future. I mean, it's a base sentence, and no one knows the future. Let's see where this is headed, and we will, of course, as a think tank organization, cover this, and we will certainly return to to the discussion. Thank you so much for all of you out there for participating, for learning, for interacting. And now I wish all of us, despite the dire times, a happy Easter break. I think we all can use a break. And yeah, thanks to all of you. Be safe, be well, and let's continue the discussion. Thank you and good night.
Thank you and good night. Over and out. Great job.